In the last section, we finished up this toString function, which can now take a deck and then turn it into one single string. So we're now ready to actually make use of this writeFile function included inside the IOUtil library, or the IOUtil package. So let's get to it. We'll first start off by defining our save-to-file function, and then we'll kind of fill in some of the different arguments that we need to pass to writeFile. So I'm going to flip back over to my code editor, and we're going to create a new function called save-to-file. Now, as usual, we need to think a little bit about the function signature here, or all the different little parts of the puzzle that we need to fit in. So first off, I think that save-to-file is definitely going to want a receiver of type deck, so that at some point in time we can do something like calling cards.save-to-file. So I'm going to add in a receiver of type deck. Then for the save-to-file function itself, does it require any arguments? Well, you'll recall that the write function, or the write-to-file function that we were just looking at, requires that we pass in a file name of type string. And so I think that it makes sense that we should allow someone who's using this package that we're putting together to pass in the name of the file, and then we will kind of forward that on to this writeFile function when we eventually call it. So for our argument list right here, I'm going to expect a file name argument of type string. Now the last thing here that I want to ask you, do we really need any return values from here? Like, is there anything that we could possibly want to return from this? Well, maybe there's not a value that you and I are necessarily going to want to return, but if you flip back over to the writeFile documentation, you'll notice that it says that if an error occurs, it's going to return it from the writeFile function. So I think that rather than us trying to figure out what's going on with some type of error being generated by writing something to a file, we should just return this error that might get produced when we attempt to write something to the hard drive. By the way, we'll talk a lot more about errors later on in the course, but for right now, let's just take this error and kind of pass it back out. So we're going to say that our save-to-file function will return something of type error. So this is an actual type right here, and as you might imagine, it represents some type of error or error message or something that went wrong with our code. Okay, so now inside of this function, we can start to write out our actual function call to save this deck to the hard drive. So we're going to reference the IOUtil package, specifically the writeFile function. The first argument will be the file name. So remember, that's here as an argument. And then the second argument should be the byte slice of data that we are trying to write or save to the hard drive. So we have the ability to turn our deck into a string, but we need to then turn that into a byte slice. So let's start off first by turning this into a string. We'll say d.toString. So there's our string. And then to turn the string into a byte slice, we can do that same type conversion that we saw just a second ago. So we're going to say that we want to have something of type byte slice. So we'll write out the type. And then inside of a set of parentheses, we'll pass the value that we have, which is d.toString, or essentially a string. Now, we have a lot of parentheses right here on the end, so do make sure your parentheses are balancing out. We've got one set of parentheses, or one closing one for the toString. We have another one for the type conversion, and then the last one for the writeFile function call. Now, writeFile takes one last argument inside of here. Remember, the last argument is a permissions thing. This permissions thing is used in case this file does not already exist. The writeFile function will set up some default permissions on the file, which essentially is saying who has access to the file, who can read it, who can write it. And so we'll just use some very default permissions of 0666. That basically just means anyone can read and write this file. Now the last thing we have to do, remember that we said that our function would return an error if one occurred whenever we tried to write this thing out to a file. So the writeFile function itself returns an error, and that's what we really want to return. So we're just going to return the entire result of the statement, like so. And I'll zoom out for just 1 second so you can see the whole line. Okay, so now when I save this, remember we have not yet imported the IOUtil package. So I just saved it inside of VS Code. If you are using VS Code and VS Code sees that you are trying to use a package that you have not yet imported, VS Code will automatically add in the import statement for you. And so here's the import statement to get that IOUtil library, or the IOUtil package. Notice how in this case it says IO/IOUtil. So the IOUtil package is kind of a sub-package inside of IO. And we actually saw that when we were looking at the documentation. So if we flip back to the documentation and then look back at where we found IOUtil, you'll notice that IOUtil is kind of nested inside of IO right here. And so we refer to this as a sub-package. And so even inside of the IOUtil, it says very clearly, oh yeah, to import this, use import IO/IOUtil. Okay. So back over inside of our code editor, I think that we are all ready to test this thing out finally. So I'm going to flip back over to our main.go file. We are creating a new deck of cards right now. We don't really need to print out the list of cards as a string anymore. Let's just attempt to save this list of cards right here, or this deck type, to our hard drive. So I'll say cards.save to file, and I need to pass in a string for the file name to use. So I'm going to pass in a string of something like my cards. Okay, so we'll save this. I'm going to change back to our terminal, and I'll run go main.go deck.go. When I do so, looks like everything ran successfully. Now if I change back over to my code editor, you'll find a new file inside of our current working directory. And so this is the file that was just written out by the save to file function call. If we open it up, you'll see that it opens up as a plain text file essentially that shows the list of cards that we just saved to the hard drive. So it looks like this definitely successfully worked. Let's take a quick break and then continue in the next section and start working on our next function. So I'll see you in just a minute.